Hello, welcome to Unlocking Landscapes, a podcast about people and places. I'm your host, Daniel Greenwood. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Chantelle Lindsay and Sam Bentley-Toon. Chantelle and Sam are environmental professionals who work together on London Wildlife Trust's Great North Wood project. Just to clarify that any views shared are their own and are not those of the organisations they have worked for. For more information about London's Great North Wood, check out the first episode of the podcast where Chris Schuler talks about his upcoming book, The Wood That Built London. In this episode, Chantelle and Sam share their experiences of protecting and managing South London's ancient woodlands. They talk about their passion for volunteering, wildlife, and some of the challenges that woodland conservation in London involves. We also discuss rewilding in a London context and whether beavers could return to London's rivers. Since recording this podcast, Sam has moved on to work on London's rivers, and Chantelle has become a minor celebrity with her brilliant appearances on Blue Peter and a Great North Wood focused segment on BBC's Springwatch. Well done, Chantelle. Great work. You too, Sam. People like Sam and Chantelle are lesser known in the conservation world, but they're having big impacts at a community level. Of course, you can say the same for many people the world over. And it's just such a pleasure to be able to feature people like Chantelle and Sam on this podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hi, Chantelle and Sam. Welcome to Unlocking Landscapes.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's go in alphabetical order. Chantelle, how are you? What have you been up to?
I'm good, thank you. This week I've actually been off work, so it's been a nice sort of, I want to say relaxed, although I've been quite busy, just ticking things off my to-do list. But yeah, I've been working at London Wildlife Trust. And then other than that, I have got a newfound enthusiasm for roller skating. So I've been trying to do that. And at the moment, I just seem to be tidying my room a lot. I don't know if that's because I'm at home a lot. So yeah, that's what I'm up to. Very exciting things.
Where do you do your roller skating? In your house?
I wish. I live near Kenley Aerodrome, which is sort of on the outskirts. It is in Croydon. It's on the outskirts, sort of like in the boundary of Surrey as well. So of course there's like a landing strip. It's like the Ministry of Defence place, quite serious. When the gates are open, you can go in. And so I've been like going up and down the little strip.
That is very cool. So that's right next to Kenley Common, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I went for a walk there the other day, and I feel like every time I go, I discover something new. And actually Sam's been down here, and I was like trying to show him where I went before, and I can never find where I went before. So guaranteed I won't be able to find where I went, but it was really, really nice. Yeah,
there's a great walk. When I used to live in London, I'd walk from Coulsdon South railway station through Farthing Downs and Happy Valley, and you can end up at Kenley Common and then go to Whiteleaf.
Yeah.
It's so nice around there. Really nice.
Yeah, I went to Happy Valley it was last Saturday as well. It was really, really nice.
And that's just been designated as a national nature reserve, all that, hasn't it?
Yes, which is a really big area, so it's really great.
Excellent. And Sam, how are you? What have you been up to?
I'm good, thanks. I started a new job about 3 weeks ago. So I used to work with Chantelle on the Great North Wood project for London Wildlife Trust. But sadly I left there but happily have a new job with Thames 21. So I've been, that's kind of been my main focus for the last 3 weeks, getting to grips with starting a new project.
And have you been doing any roller skating on airfields or?
Unfortunately not. I've been taking regular trips to the local parks, which has been nice. Yeah, exploring the local green spaces as much as I can. But I've spent a huge part of the last 3 weeks on Zoom talking to people about rivers, yeah.
And now you're here talking about woods. So you both work together on London Wildlife Trust's Great North Wood project, and I really want to hear about your personal experiences of how you came to be in those roles, which are quite unusual, really. I mean, I think when I'm in primary school, when I was asked in primary school, what did I want to be when I grew up? I said policeman. It's like, could not be further than a policeman, to be quite honest, as most policemen would probably admit, and police women as well. But yeah, I mean, you probably don't get too many young people saying, I want to be a woodland conservationist in South London or something like that. So it'd be really interesting to hear about that. So in alphabetical order, Chantelle, how did you get into your work?
When I get this question, I'm like, how far back do I go? Do I give my whole life story? I'll give little snippets.
Go for it.
So I've always been in love with the natural world. I can never remember what started it, but I've just always kind of got this feeling of just awe of like how things come to be. And just learning throughout like my academic career, just like learning about adaptations that animals have and how we fit into this world. It's just like amazes me, even to this day. So I've always had that kind of natural curiosity, and been really lucky that my mum and my sisters have been really nurturing about that. Even though like most of the time I've been like the oddball, the strange one in the family who just goes and touches people's pets and things. So yeah, I guess I kind of like followed it myself, because I think in school there's not really you're not really told that it's an option. It's kind of like, what is wildlife conservation, and you just see it on documentaries. So it was kind of like a lot of like following my nose and my own sort of research. But I managed to get to university after a bit of a hard time in sixth form. I absolutely hated sixth form, and I didn't think I was going to make it to university. But I did, and I studied animal behaviour and wildlife conservation at the University of Wolverhampton, which was absolutely amazing, because I just remember sitting in a lecture and thinking, why is everyone not learning this? Like, this is incredible. And doing like an essay on, I don't know, like, I think one of our modules was called The Life of Mammals, and I was like, this is just great. Based on a David Attenborough documentary, how it doesn't get any better than this. So yeah, I just always had that. And then I came out of university ready for a job and waiting. And I think that's, you think you're just going to get it handed to you, but it didn't, unfortunately. So I went off to Spain for a bit to teach English, which was amazing. And then when I came back, I was like, I'm determined to get into a job in conservation. That didn't happen again. I kept getting loads of like rejection letters saying you haven't got enough experience. So I took a pensions call centre job, which I learned a lot at, but I didn't enjoy. So after about a year of that, I then was like, no, come on, I really want to get into it. And that's when I saw the Keep It Wild project, which is a London Wildlife Trust project, which is aimed at 11 to 25-year-olds. And it has 5 different strands. And one of the strands is a paid traineeship for 16 to 25-year-olds. And it was like, when I first saw it, I was like, I can't believe I'm seeing this. It had like prerequisites for people from underrepresented backgrounds in the sector, from socioeconomically deprived areas. And like I said, it was paid as well, and at London Wildlife Trust. So I was like, I need this. So yeah, I remember, I started off volunteering for the youth forum, then moved on to the traineeship. And I was based with the Great Northwood Project with Sam and Edwin Mallins, who's now reserves manager. And I learned so much in that 3 months. It's ridiculous. And then as it was coming to an end, Edwin got the reserves manager position. And I never thought that I would go for the Great Northwood Project. I was kind of like, I'm not going to get it. I'm not going to have experience. But Sam and Edwin and like loads of people at the trust and my family were like, go for it, you can do it. And lo and behold, I got the job, which was like a pinch me moment. And I remember our manager, Andrew, kind of just like told me in a really calm manner in the office at Centre for Wildlife Gardening. I remember just literally wanting to like jump up and down and scream and do all that sort of stuff. But Andrew was just so chilled. I was like, oh, I've got the job. Yeah, okay, great. And then when I went home, I like screamed around the house.
When I got my first job in conservation, it was like a rave, but I was the only person. It was like me and my parents. I had to go and sit down to dinner with my parents. But yeah, I know the feeling. It's sort of ecstatic, isn't it? Well, you taught English in Spain. That's pretty cool. Did you see any nice wildlife out there?
Yes, actually. A lot of birds. To be honest, I was kind of like, I feel like I missed an opportunity there because I wasn't that into bird watching back then. So I would kind of just be like, oh, a bird, cool. So I didn't actually know a lot of the names, but there was some amazing birds out there.
Yeah, there's lots of English people go birding there, don't they? But yeah, I just wanted, before we come to Sam, I just wanted to say Keeping It Wild is such an amazing project. And it's really great to see that it's, it's making a difference in people's lives, but also bringing awesome people into organisations like London Wildlife Trust. So, if anyone else is listening and has some money to make a similar project, do it.
Yeah.
It's been such a great project, it seems.
Yeah, I think every environmental organisation should have something like it, to be honest.
Yeah, agreed. And hopefully that will become the norm. Mm-hmm. And so, Sam, how did you get into your area of work then? What is your area of work?
Well, I think similarly to Chantelle, I've always just had a sense of wonder in relation to the natural world. I think a formative TV programme for me was one that came out in the 90s, a David Attenborough programme called The Private Life of Plants. I remember watching that as a sort of, I must have been about 6 and just being completely captivated by it. And my parents bought me the sort of accompanying book and I'd spend hours looking at that. I think another key moment, I remember being in primary school and someone coming to talk about rainforests and sort of the destruction of rainforests. And I think I remember really strongly being, from that moment, sort of deciding that I would work in conservation. I went through various other ideas as well. I wanted to be a novelist or a painter and stuff, but that was the one that kind of that continued. So I think thinking about that, I always think about that in relation to environmental education for school children. And me and Chantelle have led lots of sessions with school children, and like hopefully maybe 1 or 2 of those people will go on and become conservationists. So I went on to study biology at university, and then also, like Chantelle, came out of it and didn't get a job. I worked on bars for years and did lots of internships and volunteering, and sort of 0 hours contracts and lots of very short-term contracts, before finally getting a sort of my first kind of decent job in conservation, which was the Great Northwood Project. And that was a fantastic project to kind of, I guess, cut my teeth on, in that it was hugely varied. We got to do all kinds of different stuff, like practical conservation as well as education. And we were working in the Great Northwood, which is a really exciting and historically rich place. And we had people like Daniel Greenwood to be our mentors. Not Chantelle, that was before her time, but yeah, Daniel Greenwood, you were the Sydenham Hill Wood manager. Sorry if you don't want me to say this, but I'm going to say this anyway. And you were a very inspiring person I learned a lot from you in that role.
Yeah, he's going to be on the show next week. No, thanks, Sam. It's very kind of you to say. I wanted to ask you 2 things. First, I think it's probably helpful if we just say, because we've already recorded a podcast specifically about the Great Northwood with Chris Schuler and his book that's coming out in the autumn of 2021. But would you just tell us what the Great Northwood is? So
it was a large wooded landscape, and was a key area of land for the sort of economic development of London. It was a key source of fuel and timber and oak bark, which was used in the leather tanning industry. So it kind of sat on the kind of a ridge of land that extends down from Deptford in the north down to Selhurst in the south, and was a mixture of wooded commons and coppice woodland, which were managed for centuries to produce those products. And then it sort of started to decline during the Industrial Revolution, and with the Enclosure Act, and it meant that those traditional industries sort of declined and then collapsed, and lots of the woods were lost. But we have a few fragments remaining of a mixture of kind of ancient and recent woodland that together form the sort of modern day incarnation of the Great Northwood.
Thanks, Sam. And Chantelle, you're from Croydon, right? And I'm just wondering, because I grew up in on the border of like Forest Hill and Peckham Rye and stuff, and I never knew about the Great Northwood. And you being in Croydon, you're on the kind of southern boundary of what is the historic Great Northwood. Did you know about it?
No, I didn't actually. I was actually born in Doncaster up north. I've been a bit of a move around nomad, then moved to Peterborough. So I think I came to London in around 2003. But even then, I think I guess starting off in London as kind of pre-teen, even then I didn't know about the Great Northwood landscape. It was only literally until I did the traineeship. I remember, it being one of the options on the form for where you want to be based. And I was like, oh, let me research this Great Northwood project. I was just like, wow, this is insane. I had no idea that it's so close to such a kind of like legendary landscape. So no, I didn't know anything about it.
No, it's just it seems to capture people's imagination. I mean, obviously it did massively because the National Lottery Heritage Fund invested quite a lot of money in it, and organisations like London Wildlife Trust have been investing in it for a long time. But so, what exactly is your work with the Great Northwood project? I mean, what does woodland conservation mean in London? Chantelle, do you want to go?
The Great Northwood project is sort of in two, tiers. So one part of it is practical conservation, and the other part is community engagement. So practical conservation is mainly a volunteer program. So we have 13 key sites that were factored into the project at the start when it was developed. There was quite a few that were kind of in consideration, but the 13 key sites we've chosen are across 5 boroughs in South London. So we run volunteering, and usually pre-COVID it would have been Tuesdays, Fridays, and every other Saturday. And we have a lot of really dedicated volunteers who are just amazing. And I think being a volunteer manager has been, I think, one of the best experiences, because I think, coming into a sector, you make a lot of assumptions about who's in the sector and about the volunteer groups. And I think something that did put me off when I was younger with volunteering was always trying to find volunteering groups that were quite young and people that looked like me. And it was always kind of a little bit of a struggle. So being a volunteer manager and just seeing, I guess, that you can get along with people that you didn't, that you don't really see yourself in, and just seeing the variety of people, I think that's just been absolutely amazing, seeing how dedicated people are to their space. So that's been an amazing part of it, and volunteering is really important. We couldn't get half the stuff we do done. So that involves tree planting. It involves getting rid of or removing, I should be more scientific, removing invasive plant species. We do a lot of cherry laurel work, which you probably know a lot about, Daniel. Also doing surveys and training volunteers. So it's quite varied work, and it obviously depends on the season, which is something that I've also learned, that volunteering looks completely different in the winter than it does in the summer, because we've got bird breeding seasons and things like that to consider. And then the other side of it is the community engagement, which is basically just telling anyone and everyone who will listen about the Great Northwood landscape. And that involves school sessions, primary school mainly. That involves targeted outreach. So we've worked with NCS The Challenge, which is always really amazing, because you get to work with young people and you get to almost change their perceptions and see how they go from maybe in the morning being a bit what is this, to in the afternoon, you can't stop them from working. So that's really amazing, and I think one of my favourite parts of this job. And then, as the project's meant to be coming to an end this year, there's been a lot of emphasis on legacy work. So what will happen after the project's finished, and sort of handing back to councils and handing back to friends of groups and community groups, and just empowering them so that they can continue the good work, hopefully.
Just while we're on that subject of volunteers, I just wanted to ask you about the impact that conservation volunteering has on particularly the mental health of volunteers from what you've seen? I think that's quite an important thing. I mean, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think, from personal experience, just, you hear all this research about being outside being amazing for mental health, but when you actually kind of work in it, you experience it. Like, I've had days where I just can't be bothered to get up, whatever, then you're out in the woods and it's like, I love this. Why wasn't I here earlier? So it's like that immediate turnaround. And I think definitely since COVID, it's been really apparent how important volunteering is for people, because we've had, like, in the beginning, it was like emails asking when we're going to restart, and everyone sort of ends their messages with like, hope to see you soon, hope we restart volunteering soon. So I think it definitely has a major impact on people's mental health, and we've had some really good feedback from like our evaluations that we get done on the project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the final one as well. And just the sort of testimonies in there about people meeting friends and becoming a really important part of people's lives. I think it's really, really important for social and physical and all of that.
Yeah, Sam did mention that I used to work in the Great North Wood as well, and I totally know what you mean, Chantelle, about you're really tired and you don't want to get up, and then you're in the woods and you're like, yeah, this is living, isn't it?
I've made it.
Yeah, I really miss that, to be honest. Because whenever I go to the woods, it's just like, this is where I'm supposed to be, but obviously not supposed to be most of the time. But Sam, I wanted to ask you, because you had a really important role in developing this project, and you will have seen a lot. You've spoken to so many different people about this in the early stages, when it wasn't established. What was it like convincing people that this city conservation woodland project was needed? What was that like?
To be honest, I don't think many people needed that much convincing. I spoke to a lot of different people, and not everyone had a deep connection with the woods already. Some of them did, but I think, there was a general sense that once like you say, the Great North Wood really captures people's imagination. Once you start talking about this vast ancient woodland that once sprawled across South London and that has lots of bits of it that you can still see, people are instantly kind of interested in that. I suppose one thing to think about is like the need for actual conservation work in those woods, though. Sometimes there's been a little bit of resistance in terms of the work that we've done, because people feel like these are natural spaces that don't need any input. But in fact, there's lots of things that are not natural about those spaces. Like Chantelle mentioned, cherry laurel. So that's an invasive plant that was introduced by the Victorians, and it casts a very dense shade. It's evergreen, so that shade is all year round. And it also releases cyanide into the soil as an extra kind of measure to outcompete all the plants around it. So a combination of shade and cyanide means that you don't get anything else growing with cherry laurel. So in the absence of any management, what you could end up with is a sort of monoculture of cherry laurel once the kind of oak trees that come up through that die and aren't able in the presence of that cherry laurel to reproduce. So that's one area that our management has focused on. And I think over the course of the Great North Wood project, the sheer amount of cherry laurel that we've removed has been quite staggering. And I think that alone will have a real big impact on the sort of ongoing future of the woods and the way that they'll develop and unfold, and the ecological processes that we've been able to sort of unleash. The other thing that's unnatural about the woods is the number of people that go to them. The sheer impact of visitors is huge, and we've all been, valuing our green spaces, especially deeply, I guess, in the last year or so, for obvious reasons. But that's meant that the impact on the woods has increased. So we do a lot of work to kind of try and manage the way that people move through the woods, either by improving paths to kind of guide people away from ecologically sensitive areas. We've also done fencing and dead hedging to protect certain areas. And that work can be controversial because people, for good reason, want to be able to go anywhere they like in the woods. They want to be able to experience it fully. And I can very much empathise with that. But the kind of cumulative effect of lots of people going anywhere they like in the woods is that you do lose plant species that are sensitive to trampling. And you do get a reduction in tree regeneration. And ultimately you can end up with just big areas that are kind of compacted mud without anything growing there. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, more and more in places in the Great North Wood. So there has to be some balance there between the impact on visitors and the ecology. And which isn't to say that the people visiting the woods is a negative thing in itself, because it's not. It's hugely positive that people have that space to be able to go to. And I think there's something really special about woodland, particularly in urban environments, because of the way that it kind of envelops you. Like you can be in a woodland and not see any concrete in your whole field of vision, which is like not the case for parks or more open habitats where you can see houses and roads. And yeah, something about being completely held by a natural environment is, I think that's what woods can especially offer.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because you do, having spent a lot of time in some of London's woodlands, it's so true. You can completely feel like you're not in London, and it kind of makes you wonder about, our kind of sense of space and, where cities begin and end and stuff like that, don't they? But you really can get lost in them. I wanted to ask you if you could both let me know your thoughts on this. It was something around natural versus managed landscapes. And I think, Sam, you were talking about people's perceptions of, these places shouldn't be managed. They should be left alone. And I know, Chantelle, you've been involved in some sort of rewilding projects as well, which you might want to talk about. But I was just wondering if, for both of you, I mean, what is the difference to you between a natural and managed landscape? Because, the word natural is quite unhelpful sometimes, isn't it? And obviously you can see people using that word in a way that's completely inappropriate as well when they talk about things that are natural and in so many different parts of life. But yeah, what is the difference to you between a natural and a managed landscape?
In the context of woodland, I think it's really useful to think about the whole history of woodland in the UK, to go back to the end of the last ice age and to think about what vegetation emerged as temperatures warmed and trees were able to recolonize. And I think there's the kind of idea of the wildwood, the dense, dark wildwood, which covered the whole of the UK, has been challenged a bit by scientists like Franz Vera, who talk about there being the presence of large herbivores, which are now extinct, maintaining a complex kind of shifting mosaic of habitats of grassland and scrub and trees. So in fact, the vision of the kind of primeval high woodland is maybe not the case. And then going forward a few centuries in history to when those animals were extinct, but people started to kind of manage the landscape in a way which was perhaps similar to the way that in some ways, the way that those large extinct herbivores managed it. So things like coppicing woodland, or maintaining wood pasture or hay meadows, and hedgerows. So then we come to sort of the current time in history where perhaps for the first time, there's areas of woodland that are left unmanaged. And I think that kind of, that story kind of allows a way into thinking about why management of woodlands is necessary, and why managed woodlands are richer in wildlife than unmanaged ones, because an unmanaged woodland is a sort of unnatural entity, I guess.
So it's completely opposite to what most people think, which is, I quite like that. And also it's cultural, isn't it, really? That's quite interesting, because you just described a natural landscape that in fact is cultural, because it's completely moulded by, the way that humans interact with it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I've just been reading this amazing book, which actually Chantelle got me for a leaving present when I left London Wildlife Trust, called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an Indigenous American woman and also a plant scientist. And she kind of weaves together these different strands of Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. But she talks about kind of reapproaching our relationship with the natural world and basing it on kind of gratitude and reciprocity, and thinking about our place within the ecological, the ecosphere, I guess, that, and the fact that we can contribute to the ecosystem as well as extracting from it. Like, our current model of thinking about the natural world is completely extractive, or some sort of sense of husbandry, but we're integrally a part of it, and we can contribute to it in positive ways as well as it providing everything we need, I think is, yeah.
Yeah, I read that book a little while ago. It's really recommended, really good. She has some really interesting things to say, doesn't she? The word husbandry always makes me laugh. It makes me think of like, it's what the husband does anyway.
But it's got patriarchal tones, hasn't it? That.
Yeah. And we like to smash the patriarchy on Unlocking Landscapes, so bear that in mind. So Chantelle, what's your perspective on a natural versus a managed landscape?
Yeah, I think Sam said some really interesting points there, and I think, you know, this definition of what is natural and what isn't, I think that's where you kind of like, people get stuck on that. But I mean, it's almost like you want to say that the whole world, well, most of it is unnatural because man's had a hand on it. And when I say man, I mean humankind. We're smashing the patriarchy. I want to make sure I'm getting it right.
Yeah, come on, Chantelle.
So I think, humankind's already been on the world. We've made our impact. So I think it would be quite naive to think that we could just now be like, no, hands off. We have to let it be natural, because like Sam said, a lot of the stuff that we do in the Great North Wood is removing invasive species that got here because of us. So I think it's, quite idealistic to think that, we just kind of let the world do what it does. And I mean, we could. But I think because we've had already such an impact, we've now got a responsibility to undo that impact. When I first heard about rewilding, it's kind of like, oh, okay, so I guess rewilding is just like hands off, let nature do its thing, which, it can be. But to begin with, you have to do a lot of groundwork, and it's a lot of, I'm going to replicate this natural process by bringing in these types of animals. That's what really fascinates me, how Sam mentioned, a lot of the stuff that we do in practical conservation is just kind of mimicking what would have already been done. So I find that really fascinating. So even with rewilding, there's management there, to be honest. You've got the things that they do on the Nep estate, and I'm on the youth panel for Heal Rewilding, which is turning 1 year old next week. So it's a new charity that is kind of aiming to bring a fresh outlook to rewilding and make it more accessible. So we're kind of trying to move away from this idea that rewilding is a countryside thing, and we're trying to make it, into, I guess, something that can happen in cities as well. You can rewild in cities, and like Sam said, London is so rich with green spaces, people wouldn't expect it. So one of the prerequisites for acquiring land that Heal has is that any site that they acquire will be 1 hour maximum drive from a city, which I think is amazing. And they're kind of like in these beginning stages, which I think is the thing that fascinated me and made me want to get involved with Heal, was like this concept that what is rewilding, and I want to see how it's done from the beginning, and how normal people do it, because unless you've kind of inherited the land or you're really rich and you can just be like, I'm going to buy that land, it's like, how does it actually work? And it's seeing like the crowdfunding that's going on and how you get investment. So it's a really interesting process, and it's something I'm really looking forward to being a part of. And they have this really amazing scheme called the Heal 3x3, which is generated by three words. So, which is kind of like an orientation, scheme initiative. So you can go anywhere in the UK, and the square that you're in, it will be like, you can get an ambulance there by saying, I'm at the square Mary Lamb pink and that'll bring you to your destination. So yeah, they have this really cool concept where you can sponsor this little patch of land, and then hopefully if everyone sponsors bits of land, you know, you've got that funding for it, and it's accessible because it's quite inexpensive. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's just stuff like that that just breaks down barriers for people in terms of rewilding. But yeah, I think natural versus managed is kind of like blurred lines, really. And I think, yeah, it's really important to think about where we sit, and if we can help nature in some way, do it. And if it's better for us to hands off, then that's what you should do. I think it's really case by case.
Thanks, Chantelle. Just on rewilding, but I was wondering what if you get, you know, when you are in the woods doing this stuff, I'm sure you get into conversations with visitors and volunteers as well. Are there any of these conversations that are motivated by rewilding? Have you had any sort of conversations about that?
Yeah, sometimes people talk about rewilding. I think rewilding is such, I don't know, I guess people have different definitions for it, but it can also just be such a broad term, can't it? Like, you know, a local authority might talk about rewilding a park, and that means like sowing some wildflower meadows. And that is a form of rewilding, because it's like, to some extent, you know, you're boosting biodiversity, you're to some extent recreating natural processes, which is sort of what rewilding is, I guess.
Yeah, and you sometimes, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've seen this on Twitter a couple of times from people who are they're probably like well-known botanists and people who should know better. You get like a community group who've done a really good project on their estate or something, like, you know, creating a wildflower meadow. It might not be like a chalk grassland native mix or like a perfect mixture of natural flowers, but they just get pilloried by individual ecologists or botanists who are like, how dare you do this? These are not native species. And it's like, it's just so backwards. It's like those people, they've got very little resources and they're trying to make a difference, do something positive. You know, you've got to be supportive of people, don't you? I mean,
yeah, especially if that piece of land is definitely functioning better for biodiversity than it was before. Yeah, I guess for me, rewilding in its kind of like truest sense is about reintroducing species that have been lost, species that like at Net, where they've reintroduced like English longhorn cattle and Tamworth pigs and ponies that kind of work as ecosystem architects and engineers to create a complex set of habitats. So you're kind of handing over the process of creating habitat, non-human agents. And obviously that's not feasible in lots of situations, like the Great North Wood, for example. We can't start introducing animals to these little pockets of woodland. But in other senses, in the city, I think rewilding could be possible. Like there could be sort of conservation grazing projects which bear some relation to rewilding. There's Citizen Zoo, a rewilding organisation based in London that wants to reintroduce water voles to the Hogsmill River. So it's not just something that can happen in like huge rural areas, but there are limitations of what can be done in the city in terms of rewilding. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, it's an unanswerable question, isn't it, rewilding? Because, as you say, it's different people have got so many different perspectives. Chantelle, did you have anything to add about rewilding there? Because I was wondering what you thought about what Sam said about it not being possible in London. Obviously, you can't chuck a bison onto Streatham Common or any more of them for that matter, even though they're probably quite happy in a place like Streatham Common, to be honest. As someone who studied animal behaviour and wildlife conservation, what's your perspective on rewilding in general in the UK, but also in a place like South London or the Great North Wood?
Yeah, I think that's why rewilding is so almost like controversial, because I think people think that it's just one thing. I think the beauty of it is that it is adaptable. So what you think is what is classed as rewilding in the countryside looks different to how it would in an urban environment, say in South London. So I think it is very possible. I think it's very possible to rewild in urban areas and in London, but it just looks different to what, you know, it would look like in the countryside. So, for example, you know, how you mentioned, you know, in Sussex, they've introduced animal species that we just wouldn't be able to do in the Great Northwood, for example. But what we can do is plant wildflowers that would have been there before, or wildflowers that are going to benefit the species that are there. So I think it is possible to do it. It just looks different. And yeah, Sam mentioned the Involve project, I think it's called, Get Involved project. So introducing voles to the Hopewell River, which is, yeah, I think I found out about that last year, and I only just remembered that it's in southwest London. It kind of blew my mind, because I was like, oh my God, that's so cool, voles in southwest London. And I remember Tony, who's the ecologist at London Wildlife Trust, we went to Crane Park Island, and we were trying to find voles, and it was like looking at every blade of grass and being like, is that a 45-degree angle cut? And just being like, I think this is a vole. And we couldn't find any. So it was like, I was kind of like, you know, maybe they're not here. So I think for that to be happening in southwest London is amazing, and people should be shouting about it, because it is possible to do reintroductions in London. It's not just about Scotland and places that seem really far out. So yeah, I just think it just looks different, you know, different in different places basically, but I think it is very possible.
I suppose one thing in the Great Northwood that we could maybe describe as rewilding that we've done is about like creating the conditions for certain species to thrive. So by doing bits of coppicing, by fencing areas, by removing cherry laurel, you create the conditions where you have light and you exclude trampling feet, where you get oak regeneration, where you get like the expansion of patches of ancient woodland indicators like bluebells and wood anemone and wild garlic. So you're kind of, yeah, we're not necessarily planting things, but we're adapting what's there to unleash those natural ecological processes.
Yeah, doing like a bit of damage control, I find. Yeah.
Well, what about this then? Let's say I've got some spare pet beavers that are looking for a home, and I'm wondering, do you think it's possible that they could be reintroduced to London? Because they're in Warsaw, the capital of Poland. You know, do you think it's possible, and where could they be introduced in London?
I think 100% they could be somewhere in the Thames catchment anyway. Because I've been reading a bit into it, and some of the sort of enclosed beaver reintroduction projects don't take up that much space. Like I don't know a lot about the rivers around London yet. I've just started at Thames 21 and I'm learning, so I wouldn't be able to like pinpoint a particular location, but I think there's definitely scope for that. And beavers I've just bought a book about beavers, so I'm super excited about beavers. I think in terms of rewilding, they're one of the most sort of incredible species that we could return. Just the amount of complexity that they produce, like creating these dams and these ponds, and ponds that then dry up to create wet meadows, and like semi-coppice woodland, and the beavers are doing the coppicing, and just an absolute explosion of biodiversity that they create where they're introduced, as well as reducing flood risk downstream and improving water quality. They're just a win-win-win. Although, of course, they are controversial too, because they have impacts on adjacent areas of land, for example, farmland. But I think the benefits they bring far outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know that much about rivers either, but I think we don't utilise ours enough, and we kind of almost like downplay them. So I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about the Thames, but I mean, it's a huge area, and I think, like Sam said, if they don't take up that much space and their area is quite small, then I think, yeah, it would definitely, I think, be worth looking into it and thinking about it, because, yeah, I think our rivers could do with a bit of a revamp, and they could be a really good opportunity for, seeing what beavers can do.
It sounds like you're both moving on from woodlands, and next up you're going to sort out London's rivers as well. Well, yeah, well, maybe I mean, there is the Beverley Brook, isn't there? And in West London that's actually named after beavers. So that's probably a pretty nice tie-in to get them back. So Sam, I look forward to the podcast next year when you're, live on air reintroducing beavers somewhere.
Fingers crossed.
I'd like to talk about visitors to the woodlands and the kind of some of the perspectives you get from people and some of the impacts. But I mean, we were talking about beavers there, and they cut down trees, don't they? And that's something that is very, very, very much frowned upon, particularly in the UK. People get very, very annoyed about trees being cut down, but sometimes it obviously has to happen. And it depends where the tree is and what type of tree it is. But what sort of attitudes have you experienced from visitors and members of the public about doing tree management?
I think it's been quite mixed, in my opinion. I think, one of the first volunteering sessions I did as a trainee was like cutting down cherry laurel and that sort of thing. And I was kind of like, oh my gosh, this feels so unnatural. But I was a volunteer and just being like, right, we've come here to do a bit of nature conservation. And then you're just chopping down trees. I think it's really, it's a bit of a shock. And you think like, oh, what am I doing? But I think when I was informed about why you're doing it, and it's almost like for the greater good, that's how I see conservation. It's like a lot of things you have to think about the bigger picture. You have to think about the greater good, because if you get bogged down about that single oak tree, and I know it's really controversial to say because some of the things, some of the oaks are veterans, they're really old, they've got, people are connected to them, and I completely get that. But I think, a lot of people need to think about the bigger picture. So I wasn't here, I think Sam can obviously tell you a bit more about it, but in Bigham Wood, in a Croydon site, they did a coppicing project. And it's been, I think, so far really successful. So I think that was in 2019 or 18. They did it, and it's been really successful. And, there was about 4 oaks that were coppiced. And I think maybe 2 out of the 4, I think it is, or 3 out of the 4 have sprouted, regrown. So, and that area now has little oak seedlings, and there's really loads of potential because the canopy has just been opened up. So, I think people get really fixated on these one species and its character, but when you think about the bigger picture, it's really necessary to chop down a few trees every now and then. And there's those days where it's like it feels really great to do tree planting because half the time we're taking out cherry laurel, so it's like a penance. But yeah, definitely, I think it would help people to think about the bigger picture. And once people are informed, I think people come around to the idea.
But yeah, so I was wondering, you mentioned earlier about visitor numbers and the impact of visitors. I mean, fundamentally, it is really positive, isn't it, that people are accessing these nature reserves? I mean, in my opinion, the only reason that a lot of these places are protected and invested in is because people care about them, because they mean something to the local community. How can visitor impact be made sustainable in the long term?
I think partly it's about education. It's about sort of letting people know how sensitive a lot of these areas are, particularly to trampling, also to dogs off leads, particularly during the bird nesting season. But I think it's also going to have to be some fencing. Some areas are going to have to be off limits, because as much education as you do, I think there's going to be people who disregard that. I almost don't blame them, because if we have these very limited areas of green space to visit, you want to experience it as fully as you can. But that being said, though, I think some areas do have to be protected.
I think, just adding to that, I think people underestimate the sensitivity of green spaces and woodlands. I think woodlands just look so kind of almost indestructible. They just look like they've been there for ages. And, just me walking around the woods is not going to have an impact. So I think people, don't think, like I said, about the bigger picture, that you're one of thousands that are going through this woodland. I agree with Sam. It's definitely about education, because in areas that we've taken down cherry laurel, it just looks really barren and what's been going on here. I think the Great Northwood Project has been really good at putting up signage and things like that, which it just seems like a small thing, but people come along and ask us what we're doing all the time. So it's people knowing what's going on and why. And once you know better, you do better. So, and even down to den making, there's been times when we've had to go around like the Grinches of the Great North Woods and take down dens.
I know that feeling. You know that feeling.
Yeah. And you feel really bad because it's like, people have spent their time, and it's a great way for families to interact with the wood, but then it's like, you're disrupting natural processes. So I think, once people know that, and it's all about moderation, like everything in life is. So, one den's not going to kill all the beetles, but, it's about, if you look around and you see there's about 20 dens, and don't go and add to that. So education's key.
So I've got 2 final questions for you both. The first one is, what advice do you have for people who are interested in your area of work? And Chantelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think it's important to remember that there's lots of different routes into it, because I think there is a narrative that one size fits all, and it's like you have to get these sort of GCSEs, and you have to do this volunteering, and then you get a job sort of thing, and you go to university and you get a job. I think it's important for people to remember that you don't always have to go that route, and that's what I figured out when I was going through my term on at sixth form. It was like, I'm never going to make it to uni, I'm never going to be able to get into science. And I remember a teacher telling me, actually, when I was literally like failing miserably at my studies in sixth form, that maybe you should reconsider a route in science and think about something else. And I was just like, no, there's got to be some other way. So I think it's really important for people not to get discouraged about your route into conservation or the environmental sector looking different to other people's. And another beautiful thing about the environmental sector is that there are so many different professions within it. And one of the things that I loved learning about in university was the kind of like concept, I think it's called conservation biology. And it's like the concept of different professions all working together. So you can be an environmental lawyer, you can be, something else, a nature writer, and all be working towards the same goal. Because the environment is so multifaceted that you need so many different people working it to reach the same goal. So definitely, I think just don't get bogged down by thinking that it has to look a certain way. But I would say just try to be as about it as you can, as like living and breathing it, like reading, watching documentaries, because that's one of the things that I've been really inspired about getting into this industry, and like working with people like Sam and Edwin, and like hearing about people like yourself, Daniel, and where I told you, like, I heard about you from like the first time I stepped into Sydenham Hill Wood. So I think, and how knowledgeable people are, and how passionate people are, and just like know like random stuff. Like, I can go to like Sam and ask him what this fungus is, and he like knows it. It's just like stuff like that is incredible to me. So it's like, if there's something that you're interested in, read about it and like be about it, so that when an opportunity does arise, you're ready. But also just expressing an interest as well, and not being afraid to talk to people in the industry, because actually people are quite friendly when you speak to them. So if you have to send an email, if there's no vacancies, but just send an email just to say, like, I would really love to work at London Wildlife Trust. What can I do to do that? Like, don't be afraid. I think people are a lot more open about it now, and people are wanting young people, and even career switches. That's been a lot of what I've seen in this sector as well. So, for example, like, we've had a volunteer who was a teacher, and she was volunteering with us, and then she kind of like started to get her qualifications that you don't necessarily need, but she just kind of like started to get those qualifications, and now she works for the trust. So it's, you can switch your career as well, which is inspirational.
Thanks, Chantelle. That's great. Sam?
I think I'd sort of echo a lot of what Chantelle said. I mean, it's not always the easiest sector to break into. It took me a long time, and I spent lots of time working on bars, as I said. But I think, don't get discouraged, and it's worth it in the end, and you'll get your break. But also, I guess I want to turn it around to wildlife employers in the conservation sector and say, like, there need to be better at creating new pathways into the sector that isn't unpaid internships, basically. And that comes back to the project that Chantelle was part of, the Keeping It Wild project. And like we said, I think every conservation organisation needs to have that kind of pathway into the sector. But I think there's also room for hope, because it feels like the sector's growing. It feels like there's more money coming into it, and because there's a growing understanding about there's just a growing understanding about the absolute importance of this stuff, and we need this stuff. This is an existential crisis. Like, we need to be working and thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And definitely more organisations that can need to make projects like Keeping It Wild and make them a core function of the sector, basically. But I can definitely say that you two have got the will to make it happen. I think that, the conservation movement is in good hands with you both there. But I've got one gift to end this episode with. Say that the Unlocking Landscapes fund was an unlimited amount of money, which is kind of inconceivable. But if you needed to invest in environmental or social projects, or if you wanted to invest in environmental or social projects, what would you support and why? Chantelle?
I would support, definitely, like we were just saying, I would support a lot more schemes to get young people and people who are underrepresented in the environmental sector involved in the sector. And whether that is through education. So I think there has to be a revamp of the education, maybe curriculum, in terms of, making it known. And I don't think it's fair to be like scaring toddlers and being like, we're in an existential crisis, like the world is ending. Like, I don't think that's the route. But I think for young people to grow up knowing that the environment is a priority, and that it is super, super important, just as much as money management is, same as natural world management. So I think education, I would definitely invest in that. Also into empowering communities. So I know this is kind of like I feel like I'm definitely not going to spend all the money on this, but I think like food community growing should really be invested in, so that the community knows that you can benefit from nature, and that just kind of like ties in with health as well. And I think becoming a more plant-based society. So I think, it kind of like makes people into farmers in a way. So I think that would be really amazing. And also this kind of concept of giving people the tools to group together to almost like rewild. So it's almost like people do like a community thing where they can like pool in and buy a piece of land, and then they get to choose what they do with that land, being guided towards a more sustainable natural world. But I think, I would tie something into giving communities power over their natural spaces. I feel like I've gone really small thinking. I can't really think of anything really grand and huge, but those are my small ideas.
Sounds good to me. And remember that, the amount of money is unlimited. So maybe drop me an email if you've got any more ideas.
I will do.
Thanks, Chantelle. And Sam, to finish.
I think I would want to acquire a big area of land. I love the idea that Heal were talking about it being within reach of London, within easy reach of London. But I'd want to replicate something along the lines of NEP. I'd want to do a big rewilding project, introduce some animals, introduce some beavers on a stretch of river, but also potentially have an element of sort of restorative agriculture within it as well. Trying to think about a kind of microcosm of the entire UK in terms of like how land can be productive and create a really vibrant ecosystem alongside it. And I want that to be a sort of a hub for education. So it could be like a sort of field studies centre where kids from London could come and do their A-levels and take part in science projects there. And it could be a place to trial new restorative agriculture techniques. So kind of like a combination of a really kind of combined way of looking at the land that includes rewilding and thinking about the land as productive, because we need it to support us as well.
So just adding to that, I think that's a really, really good point about like like a sort of FFC centre. Because I remember going in sixth form to, I think it's Box Hill, maybe. I can't remember where it is. And I remember going there for sixth form, like a residential trip, and it was just amazing. And I think, getting schools out into places like that where they can just, get connected with nature. And I think another thing that I've loved learning about with this project is forest schools and the concept of that, and how like bringing learning more outdoors. Because I remember in summer, where it's like every now and then you'd be able to like go outside and learn, or just like have a maths lesson outside. And I was like, this is incredible. Because I think those little connections that you kind of spark with people from a young age really matter. And it's about kind of like being proactive in encouraging people to connect with nature at any level. So it's not just about knowing every tree and knowing every like bit of Latin for it. Sometimes it's just that if you move your work at home outside, you're going to be able to concentrate better. It's going to be good for your health. I think those little connections should be sparked from young.
Thanks, Chantelle. And thanks, Sam. Yeah, really, really important points there. Totally agree. Education. It's quite interesting, actually, because when I asked other people on the podcast what they would invest in, education, particularly for children, has been another key thing as well. But we haven't had restorative agriculture until now. So thank you, Sam. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. So thank you, Chantelle. Thank you, Sam, so much for joining me for Unlocking Landscapes. I hope you've had a great time.
We have. Sorry, did we paused too long there? No, we had a great time.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much for having us, Daniel.
Thanks both. Have a great day. Take care.
And you. Bye.
Bye.